Thank you very much. Mrs. Federal Chancellor, Mr. Telchik, ladies and gentlemen. I am very grateful for the invitation to such a representative conference, which brought together politicians, military, entrepreneurs, experts from more than 40 countries of the world. The format of this conference gives me the opportunity to avoid unnecessary politeness and the need to speak in round, pleasant, but empty diplomatic clichés. The format of this conference allows me to say what I really think about international security issues. And if my arguments seem to our colleagues too polemically sharpened or inaccurate, I ask you not to be angry with me. This is just a conference, and I hope that after 2 or 3 minutes of my speech, Mr. Telchik will not turn on the red light there. So, it is known that the problems of international security are much broader than questions of military political stability. These are the stability of the world economy, overcoming poverty, economic security, and the development of dialogue between civilizations. This comprehensive indivisible nature of security is also expressed in its basic principle. The security of each is the security of all. As Franklin Roosevelt said in the early days of the outbreak of World War II, wherever peace is broken, peace is everywhere in danger and under threat. These words continue to be relevant today. By the way, this is evidenced by the theme of our conference, which is written here: global crises, global responsibility. Just 2 decades ago, the world was ideologically and economically divided, and its security was ensured by the huge strategic potentials of the 2 superpowers. The global confrontation pushed extremely acute economic and social issues to the periphery of international relations and the agenda. And, like any war, the Cold War left us with unexploded shells. Figuratively speaking, I mean ideological stereotypes, double standards, other patterns of bloc thinking. The unipolar world proposed after the Cold War also did not materialize. The history of mankind, of course, knows both periods of a unipolar state and striving for world domination. What has not happened in the history of mankind? However, what is a unipolar world? No matter how we decorate this term, it ultimately means only one thing in practice. It is one center of power, one center of power, one center of decision-making. This is a world of one master, one sovereign. And this is ultimately destructive not only for everyone who is within this system, but also for the sovereign himself, because it destroys him from the inside. And, of course, this has nothing to do with democracy, because democracy is, as you know, the power of the majority, taking into account the interests and opinions of the minority. By the way, they constantly teach Russia, us, democracy, but those who teach us, for some reason, do not really want to learn. I believe that for the modern world a unipolar model is not only unacceptable, but even impossible. And not only because with sole leadership in the modern, precisely in the modern world, neither military, political nor economic resources will be enough, but what is even more important, this model itself is non-working, since it does not and cannot have a moral base of modern civilization. At the same time, everything that is happening in the world today, and we have just begun to discuss it, is the result of attempts to introduce this very concept into world affairs, the concept of a unipolar world. And what is the result? Unilateral, Often illegitimate actions have not solved a single problem. Moreover, they have become a generator of new human tragedies and hotbeds of tension. Judge for yourself. There are no fewer wars, local and regional conflicts. Mr. Telchik mentioned this very mildly. And people in these conflicts die no less. And even more than before. Much more. Much bigger. Today we are witnessing an almost unrestrained, exaggerated use of force in international affairs, military force, a force that plunges the world into the abyss of successive conflicts. As a result, there is not enough strength for a comprehensive solution to any of them. Their political solution becomes impossible as well. We see a growing disregard for the fundamental principles of international law, moreover, individual norms, and, in fact, almost the entire system of law of one state, primarily, of course, the United States, has crossed its national borders in all areas, in the economy, in politics, and in the humanitarian sphere. And this is being imposed other states. Well, who will like it? Who will like it? In international affairs, more and more often there is a desire to resolve this or that issue based on the so-called political expediency, based on the current political situation. And this, of course, is extremely dangerous, and this leads to the fact that no one feels safe anymore. I want to emphasize this, no one feels safe. Because no one can hide behind international law like behind a stone wall. Such a policy is, of course, a catalyst for the arms race. The dominance of the factor of force inevitably fuels the craving of a number of countries for the possession of weapons of mass destruction. Moreover, fundamentally new threats have appeared, which were known before. But today they are acquiring a global character, such as terrorism. I am convinced that we have reached the turning point when everyone should seriously think about the entire architecture of global security, and here we must start from the search for a reasonable balance between the interests of all subjects of international communication. Especially now, when the international landscape is changing so tangibly and so quickly. It is changing due to the dynamic development of a number of states and regions. Mrs. Federal Chancellor has already mentioned this. Thus, the total GDP of India and China in terms of purchasing power parity is already greater than that of the United States of America. And calculated according to the same principle, the GDP of the BRIC countries, these are Brazil, Russia, India and China, exceeds the total GDP of the European Union and, according to experts, in the foreseeable historical perspective, this gap will only increase. There is no doubt that the economic potential of the new centers of world growth will inevitably be converted into political influence and will strengthen multipolarity. In this regard, the role of multilateral diplomacy is seriously increasing. There is no alternative to openness, transparency and predictability in politics, and the use of force should be a truly exceptional measure. Just like the use of the death penalty in the legal systems of some states. Today, on the contrary, we are witnessing a situation where countries where the use of the death penalty is prohibited even for murderers and other criminals. Dangerous criminals. Despite this, such countries easily take part in military operations that can hardly be called legitimate. But in these conflicts people are dying, hundreds, thousands of civilians. But, at the same time, the question arises, should we look indifferently and limply at various internal conflicts in individual countries, at the actions of authoritarian regimes, tyrants, at the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? This, in fact, was the basis of the question that was put to the Federal Chancellor by our esteemed colleague, Mr. Lieberman. Did I understand your question correctly? And, of course, this is a serious question. Can we just stare blankly at what is happening? I will try to answer your question too. Of course, we must not look indifferently. Of course not, but do we have the means to counter these threats? Of course we have. Suffice it to recall recent history. After all, there was a peaceful transition to democracy in our country. After all, the peaceful transformation of the Soviet regime took place. Peaceful transformation. And what kind of regime? With how many weapons? Including nuclear weapons? Why is it now necessary to bomb and shoot at every opportunity? Do we really lack political culture? Respect for the values of democracy and for the law in the absence of the threat of mutual destruction? I am convinced that the only decision-making mechanism on the use of military force as a last resort can only be the UN Charter, and, in this regard, I either did not understand what was said quite recently by our colleague, the Minister of Defense of Italy, or he expressed himself inaccurately. In any case, I heard that the use of force can only be considered legitimate if the decision is made in NATO or in the European Union or in the UN. If he really thinks so, then we have different points of view with him, or I misheard. The use of force can be considered legitimate only if such a decision was made on the basis and within the framework of the UN. And there is no need to replace the United Nations with either by NATO or by the European Union. And when the UN really unites the forces of the international community, which can really react to events in individual countries, when we get rid of the disregard for international law, the situation may change. Otherwise, the situation will only come to a standstill and multiply the number of serious errors. At the same time, of course, it is necessary to ensure that international law has a universal character both in the understanding and in the application of norms. And we must not forget that the democratic course of action in politics necessarily involves discussion and painstaking decision-making. Ladies and gentlemen, the potential danger of destabilizing international relations is also connected with the obvious stagnation in the field of disarmament. Russia stands for the resumption of dialogue on this important issue. It is important to preserve the stability of the international legal disarmament framework, while it is necessary to ensure the continuity of the process of reducing nuclear weapons. We have agreed with the United States of America to reduce our nuclear potentials on strategic delivery vehicles to 1,700 to 2,200 nuclear warheads by December 31, 2012. Russia intends to strictly fulfill its obligations. We hope that our partners will also act transparently, and they will not put aside, just in case, for a rainy day, an extra couple of hundred nuclear warheads. And if the new United States Secretary of Defense here today announces to us that the United States will not hide these extra charges in warehouses, or under the pillow, or under the covers, I invite everyone to stand to greet this. This would be a very important statement. Russia strictly adheres and intends to continue to adhere to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the Multilateral Missile Technology Control Regime. The principles laid down in these documents are of a universal nature. In this regard, I would like to recall that in the 1980s the USSR and the United States signed a treaty on the elimination of a whole class of medium and short-range missiles. But this document was not given a universal character. Today, a number of countries already have such missiles. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Republic of Korea, India, Iran, Pakistan, and Israel. Many other states of the world are developing these systems and plan to put them into service. And only the United States of America and Russia bear the obligation not to create such weapons systems. It is clear that under these conditions we are forced to think about ensuring our own security. At the same time, we must not allow the emergence of new destabilizing high-tech weapons. I'm not talking about measures to prevent new areas of confrontation, especially in space. Star Wars, as you know, is no longer a fantasy, but a reality. Back in the mid-1980s, our American partners intercepted their own satellite in practice. The militarization of outer space, according to Russia, can provoke unpredictable consequences for the world community, no less than the beginning of the nuclear era. And we have repeatedly come up with initiatives aimed at preventing weapons from entering space. Today I would like to inform you that we have prepared a draft treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space. In the near future, it will be sent to partners as an official proposal. Let's work on this together. We also cannot but be alarmed by the plans to deploy elements of an anti-missile defense system in Europe. Who needs another round of the inevitable arms race in this case? I deeply doubt that the Europeans themselves need this. Missile weapons that really threaten Europe, with a range of about 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers, do not exist in any of the so-called problem countries. And in the foreseeable future, it will not appear, and this is not even foreseen. But even a hypothetical launch, for example, of a North Korean missile on US territory through Western Europe is clearly contrary to the laws of ballistics. As we say in Russia, this is the same as reaching out to your left ear with your right hand. And, being here in Germany, I cannot fail to mention the crisis state of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. An adapted Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe was signed in 1999. It took into account a new geopolitical reality, the liquidation of the Warsaw Bloc. 7 years have passed since then, and only 4 states have ratified this document, including the Russian Federation. NATO countries have openly declared that they will not ratify this treaty, including provisions on flank restrictions, on the deployment of a certain number of armed forces on the flanks. Until Russia withdraws its bases from Georgia and Moldova, our troops are being withdrawn from Georgia, and even in an accelerated manner. We have solved these problems with our Georgian colleagues, and everyone knows this. Our group of 1,500 servicemen remains in Moldova, who perform peacekeeping functions and who guard ammunition depots left over from the times of the USSR. And we are constantly discussing this issue with Mr. Solana. He knows our position. We are ready to continue working in this direction. But what happens at the same time? Meanwhile, so-called light American forward bases of 5,000 bayonets each appeared in Bulgaria and Romania. It turns out that NATO is pushing its advanced forces to our state borders, and we, strictly complying with the treaty, do not react to these actions in any way. I think it's obvious that the process of NATO enlargement has nothing to do with the modernization of the alliance itself or with security in Europe. On the contrary, it is a serious provoking factor that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have a fair right to ask frankly, who is this expansion against? And what happened to the assurances given by the Western partners after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are these statements now? Nobody even remembers them, but let me remind this audience what they said. I would like to quote from the speech of NATO Secretary General Mr. Werner in Brussels on May 17, 1990. He then said, "The very fact That we are ready not to deploy NATO troops outside the territory of the FRG gives the Soviet Union firm security guarantees. Where are these guarantees? Stones and concrete blocks of the Berlin Wall have long been sold for souvenirs. But we must not forget that its fall became possible, among other things, thanks to the historical choice, including by our people, the people of Russia, the choice in favor of democracy and freedom, openness and sincere partnership with all members of the large European family. Now they are trying to impose on us new dividing lines and walls, albeit virtual, but still dividing, cutting our common continent. Will it really take many years and decades again? Will it really take a change of several generations of politicians to dismantle these new walls? Ladies and gentlemen, we unambiguously stand for the strengthening of the nuclear non-proliferation regime. The existing international legal framework makes it possible to create technologies for the production of nuclear fuel for its peaceful use. And many countries, with good reason, want to create their own nuclear power industry as the basis of their energy independence. But we also understand that these technologies can be quickly transformed into weapons-grade materials. This causes serious international tension. A vivid example of this is the situation with the Iranian nuclear program. If the international community does not come up with a reasonable solution to this conflict of interest, the world will continue to be shaken by such destabilizing crises. Because there are more threshold countries than Iran, and you and I know this. We will constantly face the threat of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Last year, Russia came up with an initiative to create multinational centers for uranium enrichment. We are open to the creation of such centers not only in Russia, but also in other countries where peaceful nuclear energy exists on a legitimate basis. States wishing to develop nuclear energy could be guaranteed to receive fuel through direct participation in the work of these centers, of course, under the strict control of the IAEA. The latest initiatives of the President of the United States of America, George Bush, are also consonant with the Russian proposal. I believe that Russia and the United States are objectively and equally interested in tightening the regimes for non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and means of its delivery. It is our countries, which are leaders in nuclear and missile potential, that should also become leaders in the development of new, tougher measures in the field of non-proliferation. Russia is ready for such work. We are consulting with our American friends. In general, we should talk about creating a whole system of political levers and economic incentives. Incentives under which states would be interested not to create their own nuclear fuel cycle capacities, but would have the opportunity to develop nuclear energy, strengthening their energy potential. In this regard, I will dwell in more detail on international energy cooperation. Mrs. Federal Chancellor also spoke about this briefly, but she mentioned it. She touched on this topic. In the energy sector, Russia is oriented towards the creation of uniform market principles and transparent conditions for all. Obviously, the price of energy carriers should be determined by the market and not be the subject of political speculation, economic pressure or blackmail. We are open for cooperation. Foreign companies participate in our largest energy projects. According to various estimates, up to 26% of oil production in Russia. Think about this figure, please. Up to 26% of oil production in Russia is accounted for by foreign capital. Try to give me an example of such a wide presence of Russian business in key sectors of the economy of Western countries. There are no such examples. I will also remind you of the ratio of investments coming to Russia and going from Russia to other countries of the world. The ratio is about 15:1. This is a visible example of the openness and stability of the Russian economy. Economic security is an area where everyone should adhere to the same principles. We are ready to compete fairly. For this, the Russian economy has more and more opportunities. Such dynamics are objectively assessed by experts and our foreign partners. For example, Russia's rating in the OECD was recently upgraded. Our country moved from the fourth risk group to the third. And I would like to take this opportunity here in Munich today to thank our German colleagues for their assistance in making the above decision. Further, as you know, the process of Russia's accession to the WTO has entered the final stage. I will note that in the course of long, difficult negotiations, we heard more than once words about freedom of speech, freedom of trade, equal opportunities, but, for some reason, exclusively in relation to the Russian market. And there is another important topic that directly affects global security. Today, everyone talks a lot about the fight against poverty. What is really going on here? On the one hand, financial resources are allocated to assistance programs for the poorest countries, and sometimes quite a lot of financial resources. But, to be honest, and many people here also know this is often done under the development of the companies of the donor countries themselves. But, at the same time, on the other hand, subsidies in agriculture remain in developed countries. Access to high technologies is limited for others, and, let's call a spade, it turns out that charitable assistance is distributed with one hand. And with the other hand, not only economic backwardness is conserved, but also profit is collected. The emerging social tension in such depressed regions inevitably results in the growth of radicalism, extremism, fuels terrorism and local conflicts. And if, in addition, all this happens, say, in the Middle East in conditions of a heightened perception of the outside world as unfair, then there is a risk of global destabilization. Obviously, the leading countries of the world must see this threat, and, accordingly, they must build a more democratic, fair system of economic relations in the world, a system that gives everyone a chance and opportunity for development. Speaking at the Conference on Security, ladies and gentlemen, one cannot pass over in silence the activities of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. As you know, it was created to consider everything. I will emphasize this. To consider all aspects of security, military, political, economic, humanitarian, and in their interconnection. What do we see in practice today? We see that this balance is clearly disturbed. They are trying to turn the OSCE into a vulgar instrument for ensuring the foreign policy interests of one or a group of countries in relation to other countries. And for this task, they also tailored the bureaucracy of the OSCE, which has absolutely nothing to do with the founding states. They tailored the decision-making procedures and the use of so-called non-governmental organizations to this task. Formally, yes, they are independent, but purposefully funded and therefore controlled. According to the fundamental documents in the humanitarian sphere, the OSCE is called upon to provide member states, at their request, with assistance in complying with international human rights standards. This is an important task. We support it, but this does not at all mean interference in the internal affairs of other countries, much less imposing on these states how they should live and develop. It is obvious that such interference does not contribute to the maturation of truly democratic states, and, on the contrary, it makes them dependent and, as a result, unstable politically and economically. We expect that the OSCE will be guided by its immediate tasks, and it will build relations with sovereign states on the basis of respect, trust and transparency. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I would like to note the following. We very often, and I personally very often hear calls for Russia from our partners, including from the European partners, to play a more and more active role in world affairs. In this regard, I will allow myself to make one small remark. We hardly need to be pushed and encouraged to do so. Russia is a country with more than 1,000 years of history. And almost always it has enjoyed the privilege of pursuing an independent foreign policy. We are not going to change this tradition today. At the same time, we clearly see how the world has changed. We realistically assess our own capabilities and our own potential. And, of course, we would also like to deal with responsible and also independent partners with whom we could work together to build a just and democratic world order, ensuring security and prosperity in it not for a few, but for all. Thank you for your attention.